The Grand Ole Opry House vibrated with the energy of 4,400 hearts beating in unison on that cold March night in Nashville, Tennessee. The golden lights of country music's most sacred stage bathed every face in the audience, reflecting decades of dreams fulfilled and stories sung. The air was thick with anticipation, and the distinctive aroma of sweet popcorn and cold beer that always accompanied big nights at the Opry. Margaret Eleanor Thompson adjusted her reading glasses for the third time in 5 minutes, her trembling hands betraying the emotion she was trying to contain. At 78, her snow-white hair carefully combed and wearing her best navy blue dress, the same one she had worn to her granddaughter's wedding 3 years ago, she was finally there. After 6 decades of listening to Reba McEntire on the radio, in her kitchen in Murfreesboro, working double shifts as a nurse at Rutherford County Hospital, she had finally managed to buy a ticket to see her idol live. "I never thought this day would come," she murmured to herself, remembering how she had saved dollar by dollar from her modest pension to make this dream come true. At her side, her 45-year-old neighbor, Patricia Ann Williams, smiled sympathetically. "You deserve to be here, Margaret, after everything you've been through," Patricia said, adjusting the scarf around her neck. She knew Margaret's story better than anyone. The sleepless nights caring for patients, the early loss of her husband in a work accident in the Tennessee coal mines, the struggle to raise 3 children alone on a nurse's salary. Across the theater, backstage, Reba McEntire applied coral lipstick in front of the mirror in her dressing room. At 69, she had the same energy that had catapulted her to stardom in the 1980s. Her signature red hair was perfectly coiffed, and her gold-fringed embroidered dress caught the light majestically. It was her 3rd consecutive performance at the Opry that month, part of a special series celebrating 5 decades of her career. "5 minutes to the stage, Reba," announced her longtime manager, Charles Montgomery Bradford III, an elegant 58-year-old man who had been with her for over 20 years. He checked his gold Rolex, a gift from Reba for his 50th birthday, and nodded with satisfaction. Everything was going according to plan. "Charlie, have you seen an audience like this in years?" Reba asked, peering through the side curtain. "There are people even in the aisles. That lady in the front row looks like she's about to cry with emotion." Charlie followed her gaze and spotted Margaret, who was checking the program for the 10th time, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anxiety and joy. "That's how we know we're still making a difference," he replied, placing his hand on Reba's shoulder. "After all these years, you still managed to touch people's hearts like that." The band was already in position on stage. Lead guitarist James Robert Sullivan, 52, a native of Memphis, tuned his gold Fender Telecaster one last time. A veteran of countless tours with country music greats, he had known Reba for 15 years and knew exactly how to create the perfect atmosphere for each song. At his side, violinist Sarah Michelle Henderson, a 28-year-old prodigy from Knoxville, warmed up her fingers with rapid scales, her electric violin gleaming under the stage lights. "Guys, today is special," James said to the band through the monitoring system. "I feel something different in the air. Let's give our best to Reba and this beautiful audience." In the technical sector, sound engineer Timothy Alexander Foster, a respected 41-year-old professional who had been working at the Opry for 2 decades, was making the final adjustments to the audio levels. He knew every acoustic detail of that historic theater, knowing exactly how to make Reba's voice sound perfect in every corner of the venue. "Sound checked, lights ready," he said through his headset to the entire crew. "It's showtime." Margaret felt her heart race as the lights in the auditorium gradually dimmed. She had dreamed of this moment for so long that she could hardly believe it was really happening. She remembered all the times she had sung along with Reba while preparing medications at the hospital, how her songs had helped her through the most difficult times after the death of her husband, Thomas Earl Thompson, 15 years ago. "Tommy, I know you're watching me from somewhere," she whispered, touching the small heart-shaped brooch that held a microscopic photo of him, her only truly valuable piece of jewelry. The audience erupted in applause as the curtain slowly opened, revealing the stage lit in shades of gold and red. The band struck the first chords of Fancy, one of Reba's biggest hits, and the crowd went wild. When Reba finally appeared, walking elegantly and confidently across the stage, the noise was deafening. "Good evening, Nashville," she shouted into the microphone, her powerful voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "It's an honor to be back in the home of country music." Margaret stood up with the rest of the audience, clapping so hard that her hands soon turned red. Tears were already streaming down her wrinkled face, carrying with them decades of pent-up emotions. Patricia held her arm affectionately, sharing in that magical moment. "She's even more beautiful in person," Margaret shouted over the noise, her voice choked with emotion. Reba began to sing, and her crystal-clear voice filled every inch of the theater. She moved across the stage with the grace of someone who was born to be there, connecting with the audience in a way that few artists could. Her gaze swept across the faces in the audience, making each person feel special, as if she were singing just for them. During the first song, Margaret sang along with every word, her weak but determined voice blending with that of her idol. It was as if all the difficulties of her life, the endless night shifts at the hospital, the bills she could barely pay, the loneliness of recent years, had disappeared in that magical moment. The show continued with a carefully chosen repertoire that spanned the greatest hits of a 5-decade career. "The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia," "Does He Love You?" "Consider Me Gone." Each song was received with growing enthusiasm. Reba's energy seemed inexhaustible, and she fed off the warm response from the audience. "You know," Reba said during a break between songs, "I started singing when I was only 5 years old, back on my family's ranch in Oklahoma. My mother always said that music had the power to heal broken hearts and bring people together. Looking at you all here today, I see that she was right." Margaret nodded vigorously, wiping away more tears. She knew this story. She had read about Reba's humble childhood in countless magazines over the years. It was part of what made her admire the singer so much, her ability to never forget where she came from, no matter how famous she became. The first set of the show was going perfectly. The band was flawless, the audience was totally engaged, and Reba was at her best. Charlie watched from backstage with a satisfied smile, making mental notes for the upcoming shows on the tour. But as the night wore on, Margaret began to feel a slight discomfort. The intense emotion, combined with the heat of the spotlights and the excitement of the crowd, was beginning to affect her blood pressure. She had forgotten to take her high blood pressure medication that morning, such was her eagerness to get to the theater. "Are you okay?" asked Patricia, noticing that Margaret looked a little pale. "I'm fine, dear," Margaret replied, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "Just a little too excited, I think." She didn't want to miss a single second of this dream show because of a little discomfort. She had waited so long for this moment that nothing in the world would make her leave before the end. As Reba continued her performance with "Somebody Should Leave," one of her most touching ballads, Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music transport her back in time. The lyrics spoke of difficult relationships and painful decisions, and each word resonated deeply in her heart. It was 1987 when she first heard this song playing on the small AM radio in her kitchen as she prepared breakfast for Thomas and their 3 children, before leaving for another double shift at the hospital. Thomas was struggling at work in the mines. The company was cutting staff, and he feared he would be next. The couple had argued the night before about money, about the uncertain future, about whether she should take on more extra shifts to make up for it. "Margaret, you work too hard," Thomas had said, holding her hands, calloused from caring for others. "I'll find a solution, you'll see. I don't want you killing yourself working like this." But Margaret knew she had no choice. As a registered nurse for over 20 years at Rutherford County Hospital, she earned a decent salary. But with 3 children at home, Robert Michael Thompson, then 16, Susan Elizabeth Thompson, 14, and the youngest, David James Thompson, only 8. Every penny was crucial. On that morning in 1987, as Reba sang on the radio about someone having to leave, Margaret could not have imagined that 2 years later it would be Thomas who would leave forever, the victim of a mine collapse that killed him and 7 other men. The cruel irony of a song about leaving relationships when what she wanted most was to never have to leave hers. "Margaret?" Patricia's voice brought her back to the present. "You seem distant." "Just remembering Tommy," Margaret replied softly, her eyes still closed, absorbing every note of Reba's performance. "He would have loved to be here with me today." Patricia knew the story. She had moved into the house next door to Margaret 10 years ago, when she was going through her own difficult divorce. Margaret had been her salvation in those first few months, bringing homemade casseroles, looking after her 2 children when she worked late as a secretary at the local school, simply being a friend when Patricia needed it most. "He's here with you," Patricia said, gently squeezing Margaret's hand. "I'm sure of it." On stage, Reba transitioned into "The Greatest Man I Never Knew," a devastatingly beautiful song about lost relationships and words left unsaid. For Margaret, each verse was like a sweet stab to the heart. She and Thomas had had a solid marriage, built on hard work and mutual love. But like many couples of that era, they rarely expressed their deepest feelings. Thomas Earl Thompson had been a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He worked brutal shifts at the Consolidated Coal Company mine to support his family, coming home covered in black dust, but always finding the energy to help Robert with his math homework, to listen to Susan talk about her problems at school, to play cowboys and Indians with David in the backyard. On weekends, when Margaret wasn't working, they would sit on the porch of their small house in Murfreesboro, drinking sweet iced coffee in the summer and hot chocolate in the winter, planning a future that would never come. Thomas dreamed of saving enough money to buy a small piece of land where they could raise a few chickens and plant a larger garden. "One day, Maggie," he would say, using the nickname only he used, "we'll have our own little farm. You won't have to work so hard, and I'll be home when the sun goes down." But life had other plans. On March 15, 1989, a methane gas explosion in the mine where Thomas worked killed 8 men instantly. Margaret could still remember exactly where she was when she got the call. She was giving an injection to a 12-year-old diabetic child, trying to distract her with silly jokes, when her supervisor came running down the hall. "Margaret, you need to come with me right now," Harold Peterson, the hospital administrator, had said, his face pale as a sheet. She knew immediately that something terrible had happened. The funeral was a blur of sympathetic faces, casseroles brought by neighbors, and the brutal reality of becoming a 37-year-old widow with 3 children to raise on her own. The mining company's compensation barely covered the medical and funeral expenses, leaving Margaret with a small mortgage and the desperate need to work even more overtime shifts. But it was Reba's music that helped her get through the darkest days. "Whoever's in New England, how blue, love will find its way to you." Each song was like a conversation with a friend who understood pain, loss, and the strength needed to carry on. Margaret had bought her first used CD player just so she could listen to Reba's albums in better quality. And many nights she fell asleep listening to that powerful voice singing about overcoming adversity and hope. Now, decades later, she was there seeing her personal hero live, and the emotion was almost unbearable. Her hands trembled slightly, a combination of age, blood pressure medication she had forgotten to take, and pure emotional adrenaline. From the stage, Reba couldn't know Margaret's personal story, but her decades of experience singing to millions of people had taught her to read the faces in the audience. She could see that the white-haired lady in the fifth row was having a deeply emotional moment, and it touched her. It was for people like her that Reba continued to sing after all these years. "This next song," Reba said into the microphone, "is for all the brave people who have faced unimaginable loss and found the strength to carry on. It's about discovering that we are more resilient than we ever thought we could be." She struck the first chords of She Thinks His Name Was John, one of her most powerful and controversial songs at the time, which tackled difficult themes about the consequences of choices and the fragility of life. It was a song that took courage to sing, especially in the conservative country music scene of the 1990s. Margaret knew every word, every emotional nuance of that performance. It had been one of the songs that helped her process her own mortality after Thomas's death, to understand that life was precious and unpredictable, and that every day was a gift to be cherished. As Reba sang, her voice full of emotion and power, Margaret felt an almost spiritual connection to the music. Tears streamed freely down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of a life lived with purpose despite the difficulties. Patricia watched Margaret with growing concern. Her friend's breathing seemed a little labored, and she was becoming visibly paler. But knowing Margaret as she did, she knew it would be nearly impossible to convince her to leave before the end of the show. "Are you sure you're okay?" she whispered again. "I've never felt better in my life," Margaret replied, and at that moment, she truly believed it. She was living a decades-long dream, surrounded by the music that had been her constant companion through all of life's joys and sorrows. On stage, James Robert Sullivan, the lead guitarist, noticed something in the audience that concerned him slightly. His wife had been a nurse before she retired, and he had learned to recognize signs of distress in people. That elderly lady in the fifth row seemed to be struggling, though she was obviously trying to hide it. He made a mental note to keep watching her, while his fingers continued to dance across the strings of his guitar, creating the perfect soundscape for Reba's unmatched voice. The show was reaching its midpoint, and the energy in the theater was electric. Reba had built a repertoire that told the story of her career, and, by extension, the story of generations of American women who had faced adversity with dignity and strength. For Margaret, each song was a chapter of her own life, each verse a validation of her experiences. She had raised 3 children on her own, worked 40 years as a nurse, cared for thousands of patients, and never had a moment like this, a moment of pure joy and recognition for her own journey. But her body, after 78 years of hard living and tireless work, was beginning to show signs that the intense emotion might be too much to bear in one night. The temperature inside the Grand Ole Opry House had risen considerably since the start of the show. With more than 4,000 people singing, dancing, and applauding, the historic theater's air conditioning system was struggling to keep the environment comfortable. Margaret felt small beads of sweat forming on her forehead, but she attributed them to the excitement of the moment. Reba had just finished Rumor Has It and was talking to the audience about her early days in Nashville, a story Margaret knew by heart but loved to hear directly from the source. When I first got here in 1975, Reba said into the microphone, walking to the edge of the stage, I was just a girl from Oklahoma, with a dream too big for my jeans. I had to learn everything from scratch. How to move on stage, how to sing with a professional band, how to deal with nerves. Margaret smiled through the growing discomfort she felt in her chest. She had always admired Reba's honesty about her humble beginnings. As the daughter of a rodeo cowboy and a schoolteacher, Reba had never pretended to be anything she wasn't. And that authenticity was one of the reasons Margaret felt such a deep connection to her. My mother, Jacqueline, Reba continued, always told me that no matter how high you rise in life, you should never forget where you came from or the people who helped you get there. And looking at you all today, I see faces that remind me of home, that remind me why I started singing in the first place. Patricia noticed that Margaret was gripping the arm of her chair with unusual force. Her fingernails, always impeccably painted light pink, were leaving small marks on the padded fabric of the armchair. Margaret, you seem to be sweating, Patricia whispered, offering a tissue from her purse. Would you like me to get you some water? No, no, Margaret shook her head quickly, not wanting to miss a second of the presentation. It's just a little hot in here. I'm fine. But the truth was that Margaret wasn't feeling well. A dull pain had begun to form in her chest, radiating to her left arm. As an experienced nurse, a small part of her mind recognized the symptoms. But the larger part, the part that had dreamed of this moment for decades, refused to accept what her body was trying to tell her. On stage, Reba began singing Does He Love You?, her famous duet that she had originally recorded with Linda Davis. For this solo performance, she sang both parts, changing her voice and posture to create the illusion of a conversation between two women. It was an impressive display of her artistry and vocal versatility. Margaret tried to sing along as she had with all the other songs, but found she was running out of breath. Her vision began to blur slightly at the edges, and she blinked several times, trying to focus on the bright stage lights. It's my age, she muttered to herself. I just need to take a deep breath. But taking a deep breath was becoming increasingly difficult. The pain in her chest was intensifying, and small waves of nausea began to wash over her. Margaret held tight to the arm of her chair, determined not to faint. Not here, not now, not in the middle of the show of her dreams. From the stage, James Robert Sullivan kept his eye on the elderly lady he had noticed earlier. Something was definitely not right. He could see that she was in distress, even from his position on stage. During an instrumental part of the song, he approached Timothy Alexander Foster, the sound engineer. "Tim," he whispered into his individual microphone, "that lady in white in the 5th row. Center. Can you have someone from security check on her?" Timothy followed James's gaze and immediately saw what the guitarist had noticed. Margaret was visibly pale and seemed to be struggling to breathe properly. "I'm already on it," Timothy replied, signaling to Michael David Richardson, the Opry House's head of security, a 44-year-old former military man who knew every inch of that theater and had dealt with medical emergencies before. Michael got the signal and immediately began moving discreetly toward Margaret, navigating the rows of seats without drawing too much attention to himself. His military experience had taught him to assess situations quickly, and he could see that this was potentially a real medical emergency. Meanwhile, Margaret was fighting an internal battle. The pain in her chest had become a constant and worrying presence, and she began to feel a strange tingling sensation in her arms. Her medical training finally overcame her emotional denial. "Patricia," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. I think something's wrong." Patricia immediately turned to Margaret with utter alarm. Her friend's face had lost almost all color, and small beads of cold sweat were visible on her forehead. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Margaret, how are you feeling?" Patricia asked, trying to keep her voice calm, but feeling panic rising in her chest. "Chest pain, difficulty breathing," Margaret admitted, finally acknowledging what her body had been trying to tell her for the last 15 minutes. I think it might be my heart." The words were like a punch in the stomach for Patricia. Margaret had always been the strong one between the two of them, the one who took care of everyone else, the nurse who knew exactly what to do in any medical emergency. Seeing her so vulnerable was terrifying. "I'll call for help," Patricia said, standing up quickly. "No!" Margaret grabbed Patricia's arm with surprising strength. "Please don't interrupt the show. Reba, this is her moment. I can't be responsible for ruining it." Even in the midst of a potential cardiac emergency, Margaret was more concerned with the well-being of her idol and the experience of thousands of other fans than with her own condition. It was a display of character that defined who she had been her entire life, always putting others before herself. Patricia was torn between respecting Margaret's wishes and doing what she knew was right. But the decision was taken out of her hands when Michael Richardson quietly approached their row. "Sorry to interrupt, ladies," he said softly, crouching down beside Margaret. "We noticed you may be feeling unwell. I'm Michael Richardson, head of security. Is there anything I can do to help?" Margaret looked at him with eyes that mixed gratitude and desperation. I'm having some heart problems, I think. But please, I don't want to cause a commotion. This show means everything to me." Michael had dealt with similar situations before. People who were clearly having medical emergencies but refused to seek help for fear of interrupting an event or causing trouble for others. "Ma'am, I understand completely," he said gently. "But my number one priority is your safety. We have a full medical team here at the theater. How about I discreetly bring them over to take a look? No one needs to know, and the show can go on as normal." Margaret hesitated for a moment, glancing at the stage where Reba continued to sing majestically, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding in the audience. "All right," she finally agreed. "But please be discreet. I don't want to ruin anyone's night." Michael spoke quickly into his portable radio, calling the medical team to the section where they were seated. Within minutes, 2 trained paramedics, Jennifer Lynn Harrison, a 34-year-old EMT, and Robert Anthony Martinez, a 41-year-old experienced paramedic, arrived with a compact medical kit. "Hello, ma'am," Jennifer said softly, crouching down on the other side of Margaret. "I'm Jennifer, an emergency medical technician. I'm just going to check a few vital signs quickly, okay?" Margaret nodded weakly. Her condition was clearly worsening, and even her natural stubbornness was beginning to yield to the medical reality of the situation. Jennifer quickly checked Margaret's pulse, irregular and rapid, and used a small oximeter to measure her oxygen saturation. The numbers weren't good. Robert quietly prepared a portable heart monitor. "What's your medical history, ma'am?" Jennifer asked as she worked. "High blood pressure, high cholesterol," Margaret replied with difficulty. "I forgot to take my meds this morning. I was so nervous about the show." Jennifer exchanged a meaningful glance with Robert. They knew they were dealing with a potentially serious cardiac emergency, possibly a heart attack, in a 78-year-old woman who had missed crucial medications in a highly emotionally and physically charged environment. "Ma'am, we're going to need to get you to proper medical care," Jennifer said gently. "An ambulance is on its way, and we have an excellent hospital just 10 minutes from here." Tears began to stream down Margaret's face, not from physical pain, but from pure sadness at having to leave the show she had waited her whole life to see. "Please," she begged, "just a few more songs. I promise I'll go to the hospital afterward. Just don't make me leave now." Robert Martinez, who had been a paramedic for over 15 years and seen countless cardiac emergencies, knew they couldn't wait. Margaret's vital signs were deteriorating, and every minute that passed increased the risk of serious or even fatal complications. "Ma'am, I understand how much this means to you," he said compassionately, "but your life is more important than any concert. We need to go now." That's when the inevitable happened. The combination of extreme emotional stress, missed medication, advanced age, and the sudden realization that she would have to leave her dream behind created the perfect storm. Margaret felt a sharp pain shoot through her chest. Her vision darkened at the edges, and she collapsed forward. "Margaret!" Patricia shouted, trying to catch her. The fainting spell was sudden and dramatic. Margaret fell from her chair, unconscious, while Robert and Jennifer immediately went into full emergency mode. The small commotion did not go unnoticed by the people in the nearby rows, who began to turn and murmur with concern. It was at this very moment, as Robert checked Margaret's pulse and Jennifer prepared emergency equipment, that something extraordinary happened. Reba McEntire, in the middle of "Consider Me Gone," noticed the commotion in the audience. Reba McEntire's trained voice faltered for just a fraction of a second when she saw the disturbance in the fifth row. In her 5-decade career, she had developed a keen instinct for reading her audience, and something was definitely wrong. She could see people standing up, urgent movement, and what appeared to be a medical emergency unfolding right in the center of her field of vision. Without hesitating for even a second, Reba stopped the song mid-verse. "Folks, let's stop here for a moment," she said into the microphone, her voice laden with genuine concern. The band stopped immediately, creating a sudden and dramatic silence in the theater. "It looks like we have a medical emergency in the audience, and we're not going to continue until we're sure everyone is okay." The silence in the Grand Ole Opry House was deafening. 4,000 people turned to look in the direction Reba was pointing, where Robert Martinez and Jennifer Harrison were working feverishly on Margaret, who lay unconscious on the floor between the rows of chairs. Charlie Bradford, watching from backstage, was momentarily shocked. In his 20 years as Reba's manager, he had never seen her stop a show like this. His first reaction was professional: concern about schedules, the costs of a prolonged interruption, the logistical complications. But knowing Reba as he did, he knew that trying to dissuade her would be futile. When it came to people in need, she had no middle ground. "What is she doing?" James Sullivan, the guitarist, whispered to Sarah Henderson, the violinist. "Being Reba," Sarah replied simply. She had worked with many artists over the years, but she had never seen anyone with Reba McEntire's instinctive compassion. From the stage, Reba could see that the situation was serious. The elderly woman, the same one she had noticed having an intense emotional reaction throughout the show, was clearly unconscious, and medical professionals were working on her. But what Reba did next surprised absolutely everyone in the theater, including her own team. She left the stage. She didn't walk down the side steps where the technical crew was. She literally jumped off the main stage, a leap of almost a meter in her ball gown and high heels, and began walking purposefully through the audience toward the emergency. "Reba, what are you doing?" Charlie shouted from backstage, but she was already too far away to hear. The audience watched in absolute silence and growing admiration as the country music legend walked through the rows of chairs, heading directly for where Margaret lay unconscious. People automatically moved aside to make way, but many reached out to touch her gently, not invasively, but in gestures of support and disbelief. "Excuse me, Reba said politely as she navigated the tight rows, her embroidered dress catching the light from the emergency lights that had been turned on when the music stopped. Robert Martinez looked up and was absolutely shocked to see Reba McEntire approaching. In his 15 years as a paramedic, he had responded to emergencies at concerts before, but he had never seen the headlining artist leave the stage to come and personally help. "I'm Reba," she said simply, kneeling down beside Margaret without worrying about her expensive dress touching the potentially dirty floor. "How can I help?" Jennifer Harrison, the emergency medical technician, was equally impressed. "Miss McEntire, she's had what appears to be a cardiac event. We're stabilizing her now, but—" "She was so excited throughout the show," Patricia interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "She waited her whole life to see her sing." "Her name is Margaret Thompson. She's 78 years old, and she's a retired nurse." Reba gently took Margaret's cold hand. "Margaret, dear, it's me, Reba. You're among friends now. These wonderful paramedics are going to take care of you." What happened next surprised even the experienced medical professionals. Reba began talking to Margaret in a way that showed real medical knowledge, not just empty words of comfort. "Robert, right?" she said, addressing the paramedic. "I can see you're already monitoring her heart rate. From her vital signs, it looks like she's stabilizing a bit. Have you given her aspirin?" Robert was momentarily speechless. "Yes, ma'am. Chewable aspirin 2 minutes ago." "How did you—" "I grew up on a ranch in Oklahoma," Reba explained quickly, never letting go of Margaret's hand. "When you live 40 miles from the nearest hospital, you learn how to handle medical emergencies. My dad broke 3 ribs when I was 14. My mom had gestational diabetes with my younger brother. You learn out of necessity." Jennifer was impressed not only by Reba's medical knowledge, but by her calm and comforting presence. Often, family and friends became hysterical during medical emergencies, but Reba was providing exactly the kind of quiet support they needed. "Margaret is responding to our interventions," Jennifer said. "Her pulse is more stable, and her breathing is improving." It was at that moment that Margaret began to regain consciousness. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused. The first thing she saw was Reba McEntire's face leaning over her, holding her hand, eyes filled with genuine concern. Am I dreaming?" Margaret murmured weakly. "No, dear," Reba replied softly, smiling with visible relief. "You had a little heart problem, but you're going to be fine. There's an ambulance on the way, and they're going to take you to get the best care." Margaret tried to sit up, but Robert gently kept her lying down. "Please, Mrs. Thompson, you need to stay still for now." I ruined your show," Margaret said, tears beginning to flow again. "I'm sorry, Reba. I'm sorry for causing all this commotion." Reba squeezed Margaret's hand more firmly. "You didn't ruin anything, dear. You gave me the opportunity to meet one of the bravest people I've ever encountered. Patricia told me that you worked as a nurse for 40 years, raised 3 children on your own after losing your husband. You're a hero, Margaret Thompson." The entire theater was completely silent, watching this extraordinary scene unfold. Many people were recording with their phones, but not in an invasive way. They were documenting something they instinctively knew was special, a moment of genuine humanity in a world that often seemed to lack it. "Besides," Reba continued, "the show isn't over. As soon as these paramedics say you're stable enough, I'm going to finish singing for you. How about that?" Margaret smiled through her tears. "You would do that? Even after all this trouble?" "Honey," Reba said, "you waited 78 years to come to my show. A few more minutes won't make a difference. And besides, everyone here has learned something important today, that caring for each other is more important than any concert schedule." The audience burst into spontaneous applause. Not the deafening applause of a concert, but respectful and emotional applause from people who recognized that they were witnessing something truly special. Michael Richardson, the head of security, approached discreetly. "Reba, the ambulance has arrived. The paramedics are ready to transport Mrs. Thompson, but they want to make sure she's completely stable first." "How long?" Reba asked. "A few more minutes for monitoring, then we can move her," Jennifer replied. Reba nodded and turned to the audience. Without a microphone, her trained voice reached every corner of the theater. "Everyone, Margaret is going to be okay," she announced. "But while we wait to make sure she's stable, how about we stay here with her? It doesn't have to be a formal show. We'll just be together." And so, on the floor of the Grand Ole Opry House, surrounded by paramedics, security guards, and an audience of 4,000 people, Reba McEntire began to sing Amazing Grace a cappella. Her voice, pure and powerful, even without amplification, filled the historic theater. One by one, people in the audience began to sing along. It wasn't a performance. It was a moment of community, of shared compassion, of recognition that sometimes the most important moments in life happen when we least expect them. Margaret, still lying on the floor, but now fully conscious and with stable vital signs, wept openly as she listened to 4,000 voices singing the old gospel melody. It was more beautiful than any show she could have imagined. "Patricia," she whispered to her friend, "I'm experiencing a miracle." "No," Patricia replied, holding her hand. "You are a miracle, Margaret. And finally, someone other than us is seeing it." 20 minutes later, with Margaret Thompson stable and being carefully placed on a stretcher by the ambulance paramedics, something even more extraordinary was about to happen. Reba, who had remained by Margaret's side throughout the medical procedure, asked a question no one expected. "Margaret, would you feel okay about being taken to the hospital if I went with you?" Jennifer Harrison and Robert Martinez exchanged surprised glances. "Miss McEntire, that would be, well, it would be unprecedented. But if that's what the patient wants and needs—" "No!" Margaret protested weakly but firmly. "Reba, you have a show to finish. All these people paid to see you. You can't abandon them because of me." Reba smiled. That warm, genuine smile that had won her millions of fans over 5 decades. "Margaret, dear, don't you get it yet? This is the show. This moment, right here, right now, is what music has always been about. Connecting people, showing compassion, being there for others when they need it most. Anyone can sing a song. Not everyone can show a brave woman that her life matters." Charlie Bradford had arrived on the scene, visibly stressed by the logistical implications of a country music superstar abandoning a sold-out show to go to the hospital with a fan. But one look at Reba's determined face told him that arguing would be futile. "Reba," he said softly, "what about the other tour dates? What about the contracts? What about—" "Charlie," Reba interrupted gently but firmly, "you've known me for 20 years. Have you ever seen me make a decision like this and regret it later?" Charlie sighed, but he couldn't help smiling. It was precisely this quality in Reba, this instinctive compassion that transcended commercial considerations, that had made her not only a star, but a truly admirable person. "No," he admitted. "I've never seen you regret helping someone." "Then trust me now," Reba said. "Besides, we have an audience full of people who just witnessed something special. They'll remember tonight for the rest of their lives. Not for the songs I sang, but for what we all learned about caring for one another." Reba turned to the audience once more. The sound system had been quickly reconnected so she could speak to everyone. "Everyone," she said, "I'm going to accompany Margaret to the hospital to make sure she's okay. I know you bought tickets for a full show, and I promise I'll make it up to you. But I hope you understand that sometimes life gives us opportunities to show who we really are, and I can't pass up this opportunity." The audience's response was immediate and overwhelming. They didn't applaud. They rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted more than 5 minutes. Many people were crying openly. This wasn't just admiration for an artist, it was recognition of a moment of pure humanity that transcended entertainment. "We love you, Reba!" someone in the audience shouted. "And we love you too, Margaret!" someone else shouted. Margaret, now securely strapped into the stretcher but fully alert, looked around the theater in utter amazement. Thousands of strangers were showing love and support for an elderly lady they didn't even know, simply because she was a human being in need of help. "Patricia," she said, holding her friend's hand, "you can go home. You don't have to come with me to the hospital." "Margaret Thompson," Patricia said firmly, "if you think I'm going home while you're in the hospital, then that bump on your head was worse than we thought. I'll take my car and meet you there." As the stretcher was carefully moved down the theater aisle, something magical happened. The entire audience began singing "Sweet Caroline," a song Margaret had mentioned to Patricia years ago that always made her smile. Someone had heard and spread the word, and now 4,000 voices were singing to her as she was taken away for medical care. "Ba, ba, ba," the crowd sang when they reached the chorus, and Margaret laughed, really laughed, for the first time in hours. "How did they know?" she asked Reba, who was walking alongside the stretcher. "Honey," Reba replied, "when people really care, they pay attention to the details." The trip to Vanderbilt University Medical Center took exactly 12 minutes. The whole way, Reba held Margaret's hand, chatting about everyday things to keep her calm and alert. She talked about her ranch in Oklahoma, her dogs, how she still cooked her own meals when she was home. "You know," Margaret said as the ambulance navigated the streets of Nashville, "I've worked in hospitals for 40 years, but I've never been a patient until today. It's scary to be on the other side." "I imagine it is," Reba replied sympathetically, "but you're in the best hands. Vanderbilt has one of the best cardiology departments in the country. And besides, you're much stronger than you think." At the hospital, the arrival of Margaret Thompson, accompanied by Reba McEntire, caused a respectful but efficient commotion. Dr. Andrew Michael Stevens, a 52-year-old experienced cardiologist who was on call that night, had been treating cardiac emergencies for more than 2 decades, but he had never had a country music legend accompanying a patient. "Mrs. Thompson," he said after reviewing the paramedics' reports, "you had what we call a minor cardiac event. Not a full-blown heart attack, but your heart was under significant stress. With proper medication and some lifestyle changes, you should make a full recovery." Margaret sighed with relief, and Reba squeezed her hand encouragingly. "Doctor," Reba said, "may I ask about the long-term prognosis? Margaret is a very special person, and we want to make sure she'll be with us for many years to come." Dr. Stevens smiled. "With proper care, I see no reason why she shouldn't have many good years ahead of her, but she will need to take her medication regularly. No skipping doses because she's nervous about shows," he said with a gentle wink to Margaret. "Doctor," Margaret said, "may I ask a personal question? Do you know Reba's music?" "Mrs. Thompson, doctor," Stevens replied with a smile. "My wife has been forcing me to listen to country music for 25 years of marriage. I know every song Miss McEntire has ever recorded, whether I like it or not." Everyone laughed, and the tension in the room eased considerably. 3 hours later, with Margaret stabilized and admitted for observation overnight, Reba finally prepared to leave. She had remained at the hospital throughout the tests, talking with Margaret, getting to know Patricia better, and even singing softly to other heart patients who had asked. "Reba," Margaret said, holding her hand one last time, "how can I ever thank you for what you did today? You literally saved my life. But more than that, you showed me that kindness still exists in the world." Margaret, Reba replied. "You gave me a much greater gift. You reminded me why I started singing in the first place. It's not about fame or money or awards. It's about human connections. It's about being there for others. You've given me the opportunity to be the person my mother raised me to be. Can I ask you something?" Margaret said timidly. "Anything," Reba replied. Would you sing Amazing Grace one more time, just for me?" And so, in room 314 of Vanderbilt University Medical Center, at 2:30 a.m., on a Thursday in March, Reba McEntire sang Amazing Grace to an audience of one, a 78-year-old retired nurse who had waited her whole life to hear that voice live. When Reba finally left the hospital at 3 a.m., she found Charlie waiting in the parking lot with the rest of her crew. James Sullivan, Sarah Henderson, Timothy Foster. They had all waited to make sure that both Reba and Margaret were okay. "How is she?" Sarah asked immediately. "She'll be fine," Reba replied, smiling despite her exhaustion. "She'll make a full recovery." "What about you?" Charlie asked. "How are you?" Reba paused for a moment, considering the question. She had lost thousands of dollars in concert revenue, likely created logistical complications for the entire tour, and endured one of the most emotionally intense nights of her career. "I've never felt better," she said finally, and everyone could see that she really meant it. 6 months later, Margaret Thompson was fully recovered and healthier than she had been in years. She had followed all her doctor's instructions religiously, taken her medications on time, and even started a light exercise program. More importantly, she had discovered a new purpose. Inspired by Reba's gesture, Margaret began volunteering at the hospital where she had been treated, offering emotional support to other heart patients. She often told the story of that night at the Opry House, not as a way to brag, but as a way to show people that genuine kindness still existed in the world. Patricia was still her best friend and constant companion, and the two often referred to that night as the Opry Miracle. Reba, for her part, had learned something equally valuable. The show she didn't finish that night in March became legendary in the history of country music. Amateur recordings of the moment she jumped off the stage to help Margaret went viral, viewed by millions of people around the world. But what mattered most to Reba wasn't the views or the media praise. It was the letter she received from Margaret 3 weeks after the incident. "Dear Reba, you gave me so much more than a night of wonderful music. You showed me that a life of service to others, whether as a nurse or a singer, is a life well lived. You taught me that it's never too late to make new friends, to be brave, or to discover that we are all connected in ways we cannot imagine. Thank you for saving me, but thank you even more for reminding me that I am worth saving. With love and eternal gratitude, Margaret Eleanor Thompson." Reba kept this letter in her dressing room and read it before every show. It was a reminder that the true measure of success is not in the awards we win or the records we break, but in the moments when we choose to see each other's humanity and act with compassion. The story of Margaret and Reba became more than just an anecdote about a night at the Grand Ole Opry House. It became a symbol that, in a world that often seems divided and cold, simple acts of human kindness can still transform lives, create unexpected connections, and remind us that we all deserve to be seen, valued, and cared for. And every time Reba sings now, she remembers that somewhere in the audience there may be another Margaret Thompson, someone who has waited their whole life for that moment, someone whose heart is full of untold stories, someone who deserves to be seen not just as a face in the crowd, but as a precious human being with a life that matters. This is the true magic of music. It's not in the stage lights or the deafening applause, but in its ability to connect us to one another, to remind us of our shared humanity and to inspire us to be the kindest, most compassionate versions of ourselves. And sometimes, just sometimes, that magic happens when a country music legend sees an elderly woman fainting in the audience and decides that no concert is more important than a human life.